Most people think civilizations were built by conquerors, by emperors on horseback, by armies crossing mountains, by generals whose names we still remember. But there is another story, quieter, older, and in many ways more powerful than any of those. It is the story of the harbor. Not the battle, the harbor. The narrow strip of sheltered water where a ship tied up, where a man with a tablet stood waiting, where the entire wealth of the ancient world passed through a single controlled threshold and was taxed, recorded, and permitted, or denied. The Phoenicians built an empire that stretched from Lebanon to the Atlantic coast of Spain, and they never needed an army to do it. They needed purple dye and the knowledge of where the tin was. Athens did not become the birthplace of philosophy because of virtue alone. It became great because the silver from its mines built a fleet, and that fleet controlled the sea lanes. And those sea lanes brought the grain that fed a city too large to feed itself. Rome, at its peak, could not survive for more than a few months without ships it did not own, carrying grain it could not grow. Through ports it had spent centuries engineering from scratch. And when those ports failed, even briefly, the empire felt it. This is the story of those ports, of the people who built them, and the people who controlled them, and the extraordinary lengths that ancient civilizations went to in order to make sure that the ships kept coming, the ledgers kept filling, and the threshold between the open sea and the settled world stayed firmly in their hands. It begins, as most things do, with someone waiting at the water's edge, watching a ship come in, and knowing that everything depends on what it carries. Imagine you are standing at the edge of a harbor. Not a modern harbor, with its cranes and container stacks and diesel smoke, but something far older. A harbor from a time when the arrival of a single ship could change the price of grain across an entire civilization. The water is the color of hammered bronze in the late afternoon light. The smell of salt and fish oil and sun-baked timber hangs in the air like something you could almost touch. And from across the water, moving with the slow, heavy certainty of something that has crossed an unimaginable distance, a ship is coming in. Its sail is down. The oarsmen are rowing now, pulling in long measured strokes, reading the current the way a shepherd reads the land. Aboard that vessel is a cargo that someone, somewhere, has been waiting months for. Copper ingots from the mines of Cyprus, stacked in the hull like orange-red bread loaves. Jars of wine sealed with wax and cloth, their contents sloshing in the dark below deck. Maybe bolts of linen or cones of purple dye, worth more by weight than silver. Maybe a chest of tin, which alone, when mixed with copper, will make the bronze that makes the tools that build the cities that hold this whole world together. The harbour master sees the ship before anyone else does. He has been waiting on the stone quay since morning, because this is his job, and because in the world we are about to enter, the harbour master is one of the most powerful people alive. He carries a reed stylus, or later a wax tablet, or later still a ledger bound in leather. He is going to write down everything that comes off that ship, every jar, every ingot, every bale of cloth. He is going to assess what is owed to the king, or the temple, or the merchant council, or whatever power has claimed dominion over this particular stretch of water. He is going to decide what gets in and what doesn't. That moment, repeated thousands of times across thousands of years in harbours, from the Persian Gulf to to the Aegean Sea, to the coast of West Africa, to the bays of the South China Sea, is the moment we are going to spend the next several hours exploring. Because what that harbour master represents, what the harbour itself represents, is one of the most fundamental and underappreciated forces in human history. Not armies, not kings, not even agriculture, though agriculture feeds everything else. What drove the shape of the ancient world? What determined which cities grew rich and which decayed into sand? What decided which cultures survived long enough to pass their ideas down to us? Was the port? Was the harbour? Was the narrow, controlled, carefully managed threshold between the open sea and the settled land? We tend to think of ancient history in terms of battles and dynasties. We remember the generals and the emperors. We picture armies marching across plains, or walls being built, or pyramids rising out of desert heat. But all of that, the armies, the empires, the monuments, required something more fundamental before it could exist. They required wealth. And in the ancient world, wealth moved by water. The sea was not merely a highway. It was the highway, the only practical way to move large quantities of goods across significant distances before the age of rail and road. A merchant cart drawn by 2 oxen on a Roman road might carry, on a good day, perhaps 400 kilograms of goods. A single medium-sized merchant vessel of the same era could carry 40,000 kilograms, 100 times more cargo, traveling faster, over distances that no cart road could cover. The sea didn't just facilitate trade, it made trade possible at a scale that could feed civilizations, fund governments, and topple kingdoms. And the port was the only way in. Every ship that crossed those waters, no matter where it came from, no matter what it carried, eventually had to stop somewhere. It needed fresh water. It needed food for the crew. It needed to offload its cargo and pick up the next one. And in that moment of stopping, in that necessary, inescapable pause at the harbour's edge, the city that owned that harbour had the ship exactly where it wanted it. That is the quiet power we are going to trace through the ancient world. Not the power of conquest, though conquest certainly features in this story, but the power of the threshold, the power of the gate, the power of the place where the open, anarchic, ungoverned sea meets the organized, taxed, monitored, controlled world of human settlement. We will move through time carefully. We will begin in the warm shallows of the Persian Gulf, where the earliest known long-distance trade networks grew up along the coasts of ancient Mesopotamia, and where merchants scratched records of their voyages onto clay tablets that have survived 4,000 years of burial to land in museums where scholars are still arguing about what they mean. We will sail west to the eastern Mediterranean, where the Phoenicians built a commercial empire so sophisticated that its ghost is still visible in the alphabet you are using right now to read these very words. Because the letters of that alphabet began as a merchant's shorthand, designed so that a port agent could record a transaction quickly and accurately without needing years of scribal training. We will walk through the sunken streets of Thonis-Heracleion, the great lost port of Egypt, which vanished beneath the sea 2,000 years ago and was rediscovered only in the year 2000. Its temples and statues and anchors still sitting in the silt of the Nile Delta, waiting. We will stand on the quays of Piraeus, the port of Athens, and understand how it was not philosophy or democracy alone that made Athens great, but the silver and grain that flowed through those docks and funded every school and temple and fleet. We will smell the warehouses of Carthage, that extraordinary city whose double harbour, one for warships, one for merchants, represented a sophistication in urban planning that Rome eventually found so threatening it spent 3 wars trying to erase it from the earth. We will follow the trade winds across the Indian Ocean to the ports of the Malabar coast, where Indian merchants had cracked the secret of the seasonal monsoon winds centuries before any European navigator thought to ask how the spice ships always seemed to know which way to sail. We will visit Guangzhou in the Tang dynasty, the first truly global port city, where Arab and Persian and Jewish and Indian merchants all lived in separate districts within the same city walls, conducting business in half a dozen languages, while the harbour filled and emptied like a tide with the wealth of the entire known world. And eventually, we will stop at the harbour's edge and look out at the same water those ancient merchants looked at, and we will see that nothing has really changed. The harbour is still there. The power is still there. The need to control who comes in, what they bring, what they pay for the privilege. That need is as old as civilization itself, perhaps older. But first, let us go back to the beginning. Not to Greece or Rome, not even to Egypt. Let us go much further back, to a time when the world's first cities were rising out of the flat, reedy marshes of southern Mesopotamia, and the first merchants were learning that the sea had a language, and that if you listened carefully enough, it would tell you exactly where the money was. The city of Ur sits today in southern Iraq, surrounded by desert so flat and featureless that it can be difficult to believe you are standing at the edge of one of the great harbours of the ancient world. There are no cliffs here, no dramatic rocky coastline, just sand and the remnants of mud brick walls bleached white by millennia of sun, and the occasional tuft of dry grass bending in a hot wind. But 5,000 years ago, this landscape looked entirely different. The Persian Gulf extended much further north than it does today. The Euphrates and Tigris rivers braided and merged in a vast delta of marshes and shallow lagoons and reed beds that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. And at the southern edge of this watery world, where the rivers met the sea, the first urban civilizations in human history were building the first port economies. Ur was not the only city in this landscape. Eridu was older. Uruk was larger. There was a whole cluster of ancient Sumerian cities rising from the mud of the river delta, each one centered on a temple complex dedicated to a particular god, each one surrounded by the agricultural villages that fed it. But what made Ur distinctive? What gave it a particular prominence in the archaeological record and in the trading networks of the ancient Persian Gulf was its position. Ur sat close enough to the water to conduct sea trade, and its merchants appear to have understood, earlier than almost anyone else in the ancient world, that the harbour was not just a place to park boats. It was an institution. It was a mechanism of control. We know this in part because of the clay tablets. Thousands of them, baked hard by the fires that periodically swept through ancient Mesopotamian archives, preserved in the dry desert soil for archaeologists to unearth starting in the 19th century. These tablets are, in the most literal sense possible, the receipts of the ancient world. They record loans and deliveries and inventories and debts in the wedge-shaped script called cuneiform, the world's first true writing system, developed not for poetry or religion, those came later, but for accounting, for tracking goods, for knowing, with precision, what came in and what went out. One remarkable archive from the city of Ur, dating to roughly 2000 BCE, contains the records of a merchant named Ea-Nasir. He was, by the evidence of his own documents, a man of considerable enterprise and somewhat questionable integrity. Ea-Nasir traded in copper, buying it from the island of Dilmun, which we now believe corresponds to modern Bahrain, and reselling it in Ur at a significant markup. But what makes his archive particularly fascinating is not just the commercial transactions it records, it is the complaints. Ea-Nasir's archive contains what are almost certainly the world's oldest surviving letters of complaint from dissatisfied customers. In one famous example, a man named Nani wrote to Ea-Nasir in terms of genuine outrage, describing how the copper he had been sold was of inferior quality, how Ea-Nasir's agents had treated him with contempt when he tried to return it, and how he, Nani, expected the matter to be remedied. The tablet is still readable after 4,000 years, and the fury in it has not diminished at all with time. But Nani's complaint also tells us something important about the trading network that made Ea-Nasir's business possible. Dilmun was not merely a stop on a trade route. It was a trading hub, a port of exchange where merchants from the Indus Valley civilization, the Gulf Coast, and Mesopotamia all met to conduct business. Goods from as far away as what is now Pakistan appeared in Dilmun's markets. Carnelian beads and steertight vessels and cotton cloth from the great Indus cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa moved through Dilmun's harbour on their way to the courts of Ur and Uruk. And moving the other direction, silver and grain and textiles from Mesopotamia flowed outward through the same channel. This is what makes Dilmun so extraordinary, and why it appears in Mesopotamian texts, not just as a trading partner, but almost as a mythological place, a paradise island somewhere in the southern sea. The Sumerians called it the land of the living, a place untouched by death and disease. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest surviving works of literature in the world, sends its hero to a distant island across the sea in search of immortality. Most scholars believe Dilmun is the inspiration for that island, and the reason it carries such mythological weight is probably quite simple. Dilmun was a place where extraordinary things came from, goods that had no analogue in Mesopotamia, semi-precious stones in colours that did not exist in the river delta, woods with grains no local carpenter had ever worked, spices with tastes and smells that seemed to belong to another world entirely. All of these things appeared in Dilmun, seemingly from nowhere, because nobody in Mesopotamia fully knew where the trade routes went beyond the island. Dilmun's merchants, like all good harbour masters, kept their sources carefully to themselves. This practice of deliberate geographic obscurity was not specific to Dilmun. It appears again and again in the history of ancient ports, so consistently that it amounts almost to a principle of commercial strategy. The port that controlled a trade route did not advertise its sources. The harbour that sat between a supplier and a customer made itself indispensable by being the only party that knew both sides of the equation. Ea-Nasir knew who mined the copper and who needed it. Nani knew only Ea-Nasir. This knowledge gap was the harbour's great asset, and ancient merchants protected it ferociously. Greek writers noted with frustration that Phoenician sailors would sometimes deliberately run their own ships aground, rather than allow following vessels to discover where they were going. Arabian spice merchants told elaborate, and thoroughly fictitious stories about the dangers and monsters that guarded the cinnamon trees. To discourage competition, the Indian traders who ran the monsoon routes across the Indian Ocean told no one about the monsoon itself for as long as they could possibly keep the secret. Information in the ancient port economy was not just valuable, it was cargo. It was the most valuable cargo of all, and the most carefully guarded. A harbour city that knew the routes, that had the charts, the pilots, the seasonal sailing schedules, the contacts in foreign ports, had something that no army could easily take away. Military power could capture a harbour, but capturing a harbour's knowledge was much harder. You had to keep the sailors alive, keep the merchants cooperative, maintain the network of relationships and reputation that made foreign traders willing to come to your port in the first place, rather than someone else's. This is why the great ancient port cities, Tyre, Carthage, Alexandria, Venice, were all known for a certain pragmatic hospitality. They were places where foreigners were, within limits, welcome. Because foreign traders brought foreign knowledge, and foreign knowledge was the lifeblood of the harbour economy. Back in the harbour itself was probably a modest affair by later standards, a system of canals connecting the city to the rivers, perhaps a stone or mud brick quay where boats could tie up. Certainly a series of warehouses where goods could be stored while they awaited their next leg of the journey. But the institutional machinery that surrounded it was already sophisticated. There were weigh stations for goods, staffed by officials who recorded transactions on clay tablets. There were temples that functioned as banks, lending silver to merchants at interest and receiving a portion of the profits in return. There were legal codes. The Code of Ur-Nammu, written around 2100 BCE, is one of the oldest known, that regulated commercial disputes and set standards for weights and measures to prevent the fraud that was apparently a perennial feature of ancient harbour life. The temples deserve particular attention because in the Sumerian world, they were not merely religious institutions. They were the dominant economic actors in the city. The great temple complexes of Ur and Uruk owned vast tracts of agricultural land, ran workshops that produced textiles and metalwork, and organized the labor of thousands of workers. They also financed maritime trade. A merchant who wanted to outfit a voyage to Dilmun would typically approach the temple for backing, receiving silver and goods to trade in exchange for a contractual agreement to repay the loan, with interest and with the understanding that if the ship sank, if the cargo was lost to pirates or storms, the debt was forgiven. This was not charity. It was a sophisticated understanding of risk, embedded in a commercial system that the temples had every reason to make work. Because the temple's wealth depended on the harbour's success. The god of Ur was, in a very real sense, a merchant god. This relationship between sacred power and commercial infrastructure is something we will encounter again and again as we move through the ancient world. The harbour was not a secular institution. It was embedded in the religious and political life of the city in ways that can be difficult for modern minds to fully grasp. The harbour master's authority derived not just from the king, but from the god. The weights and measures that governed trade were maintained in the temple under divine supervision. When a merchant swore to the terms of a contract, he swore by the city's patron deity. And the great festivals of the Mesopotamian calendar, the New Year celebration, the ritual processions of the divine statues, were timed in part around the sailing seasons. around the arrival of trading fleets, around the moments when the city's connection to the wider world was most visible and most celebrated. Because the arrival of a trading ship was, in the ancient world, genuinely miraculous. It was proof that the world was larger than your city walls. It was proof that somewhere out there, across the water, there were other people living other lives, building other things, wanting what you had, and having what you wanted. Every ship that came into the harbour of or Dilmun, or later Tyre or Athens, was a small refutation of the idea that the universe ended at the horizon, and the harbour, that controlled, managed, taxed, regulated threshold between the unknown sea and the known city, was where that miracle happened every time. There is a colour that does not exist in nature the way the ancients experienced it. Or rather, it exists, but only in very specific circumstances. At dawn, or at dusk, when the light falls at the exact right angle on certain flowers, certain stones, certain feathers. It is a deep, rich, indescribable purple-red, a colour that sits somewhere between blood and twilight, a colour that seems to absorb the eye rather than simply reflect it. The Greeks called it porphyra. The Romans called it purpura. We call it Tyrian purple, after the city that controlled its production for nearly 1,000 years, and the substance that produced it, a mucus secreted by a small sea snail called the murex, was, weight for weight, more valuable than gold for most of its commercial history. To extract Tyrian purple, you needed the snails, tens of thousands of them, collected from the rocky coastline of the Levant, piled into stone vats, left to die in their own fluids for precisely the right amount of time, not too long, or the colour would fade, not too short, or it would not set properly. The smell produced by this process was, by all ancient accounts, catastrophically bad. The Roman writer Pliny described it as offensive enough to drive away anyone without a financial stake in the outcome. The vats where the dye was produced were typically located downwind of the city, on the rocks at the edge of the harbour, close enough to the water to receive fresh snail deliveries, but far enough from the city centre that the citizens could live their lives without constant exposure to what amounted to industrial-scale decomposition. The city of Tyre, built on a rocky island just off the coast of what is now Lebanon, had been making this dye for so long that the beach outside the city was said to be stained purple all the way down to the waterline, the accumulated waste of centuries of dye production ground into the sand by the tides. And that purple dye was the foundation upon which one of the ancient world's most remarkable commercial empires was built. An empire not of territory, but of ports, not of soldiers, but of sailors, not of land, but of sea lanes that the Phoenicians knew better than anyone else alive. The Phoenicians are a people who deserve far more credit than history typically grants them. They did not build the largest empire. They did not produce the most celebrated philosophers or the most enduring artworks. What they built was something subtler, and in some ways more lasting. A commercial network that stretched from the eastern shore of the Mediterranean to the Atlantic coast of Morocco, connected by ports and trading stations and colonies that they planted wherever they found a good harbour and a willing local population to trade with. They were, in the most precise sense of the term, the world's first globalists, people who understood that distance was not an obstacle, but a commercial opportunity. Tyre and Sidon were the two great Phoenician city-states, and their relationship was complex, competitive, and ultimately complementary. Sidon was older. It had been a significant port since at least the 3rd millennium BCE, its craftsmen famous throughout the ancient Near East for metalwork and glasswork. The Phoenicians were, among their other accomplishments, among the first mass producers of clear glass, another product that travelled the sea lanes and fetched extraordinary prices in places where glass-making technology was unknown. But Tyre became the dominant power and remained so through the 1st millennium BCE because of a series of decisions made by its kings and merchant families that turned a rocky island city into the hub of the most sophisticated port network in the ancient world. The island location of Tyre was itself a kind of strategic genius. It was, as islands go, not particularly large, perhaps a kilometre from one end to the other, but it was surrounded on all sides by water, which made it extraordinarily defensible. The Assyrian king Shalmaneser V besieged Tyre for 5 years and failed to take it. Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon besieged it for 13 years. Even Alexander the Great, who eventually did take the city in 332 BCE, needed 7 months and was forced to build a causeway a kilometre long out into the sea before he could get his siege engines close enough to do any damage. The island was a harbour in itself, with 2 separate anchorages, one on the north side, one on the south, so that Tyrian ships could use whichever was better protected from the prevailing winds on any given day. The city was, in essence, a ship that could not be sunk and could not be easily stormed, a port in the shape of a fortress. From this extraordinary base, Tyrian merchants extended their reach westward along the African coast and northward through the Greek islands, and ultimately to the far corners of the Mediterranean world. The story of how they did this is inseparable from the story of their most famous product. Tyrian purple was not merely a luxury good, it was a technology of political power, and Phoenician merchants understood this perfectly. The colour purple had become, by roughly 1000 BCE, the colour of kings throughout the Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. To wear purple was to announce that you were a person of supreme authority. To give purple cloth as a gift was to offer a symbol of that authority. The Phoenicians, as the sole producers of the authentic article, were therefore in the extraordinary position of being the suppliers of something that every king and powerful person in the known world wanted, and that nobody else could provide. This created a commercial relationship that was also a political one. When Phoenician merchants arrived at a foreign court, they did not come merely as traders. They came as the people who could give the king what he needed to look like a king. They came with the purple. And in exchange for the purple and the cedar timber from the mountains of Lebanon that was the finest building wood in the ancient world, and the glass and the metalwork and the carved ivory and the linen, they received access to markets, to harbours, to anchorage rights, to the protection of local rulers who had every reason to keep the Phoenician merchants coming back. The founding of Carthage, probably in the 9th century BCE, is the most dramatic expression of this strategy of commercial colonization. The story, as told by later Roman writers, involves a Phoenician princess named Dido, who fled Tyre after her brother Pygmalion murdered her husband for his wealth. She arrived on the coast of North Africa with a group of followers, and she negotiated with the local Berber king for as much land as could be enclosed by an ox hide. The king agreed, thinking this was a trivially small amount. Dido cut the oxhide into the thinnest possible strips and used them to enclose a hilltop large enough to build a city on. It is almost certainly a legendary embellishment, the kind of founding story that every ancient city eventually accumulates, but it preserves something true. The Phoenicians were famous for negotiating cleverly, for finding creative solutions to the problem of establishing themselves in foreign territories, and for turning a modest foothold into something much larger through patience and commercial acumen rather than military force. Carthage grew to become a metropolis of perhaps 400,000 people, or one of the largest cities in the ancient Mediterranean, and its power derived entirely from its position as a port. It sat at the narrow waist of the Mediterranean, where the sea pinches between the coast of modern Tunisia and the island of Sicily to form a choke point barely 150 kilometers wide. Every ship traveling from the western Mediterranean to the eastern had to pass through this gap. And Carthage, sitting on its peninsula with its extraordinary double harbour, watched every one of them. We will return to Carthage in detail later, because its harbour was a masterpiece of ancient engineering. But for now, what matters is understanding why Carthage was placed where it was. Because the Phoenicians had an eye for choke points the way a chess player has an eye for the centre of the board. The other great Phoenician foundation in the western Mediterranean was Ghardia, modern Cadiz, on the Atlantic coast of Spain, and its existence tells us something remarkable about Phoenician navigational ambition. To reach Ghardia from Tyre, you had to sail the entire length of the Mediterranean and pass through the Strait of Gibraltar, which the ancients called the Pillars of Hercules and believed to be the literal edge of the world. Greek sailors, for the most part, accepted this belief at face value. The Atlantic was terra incognita, the outer ocean, the place where the sea drained away into darkness. The Phoenicians went through anyway, because on the other side of the Pillars of Hercules was access to the tin mines of Cornwall in Britain, the gold of West Africa, the Atlantic fisheries, and ultimately the rich silver mines of the Iberian Peninsula. The Phoenicians, it seems, were not particularly impressed by mythological barriers when there was profit to be made on the other side. They maintained the secret of these Atlantic routes with extraordinary determination. Phoenician ship captains sailing westward are reported to have deliberately run their vessels aground, sacrificing their own cargo and ships, rather than allow Roman or Greek vessels following them to discover the route through the strait and beyond. One famous story tells of a Phoenician captain who, finding himself being followed into the Atlantic by a foreign vessel, lured the pursuer onto a hidden reef that the Phoenician knew, and the following ship did not. The Phoenician ship was wrecked, but so was the pursuer. The captain reportedly received a state pension from Carthage for this act of commercial self-sacrifice. Whether the story is literally true is almost impossible to say. What it tells us with absolute certainty is that geographic knowledge, the knowledge of where the harbours were, where the shoals were, where the routes went, was understood to be worth more than ships and cargo combined. It was the kind of knowledge you burned your own vessel to protect. The Phoenician alphabet, which most of us use every day without knowing it, was born from this commercial world. The writing systems that preceded it, Egyptian hieroglyphics, Mesopotamian cuneiform, Minoan linear A and B, were all complex, requiring years of scribal training to master. They were instruments of the temple and the palace, not of the harbour. The Phoenician innovation was to strip writing down to its absolute essentials, 22 consonantal signs, each representing a single sound, simple enough to carve into clay or scratch on pottery or write on papyrus quickly and accurately. It was, in every sense, a merchant's tool, a system designed so that a port agent could record the cargo manifest of a ship without needing a professional scribe, so that a letter of credit could be sent across the Mediterranean and read by a trading partner who had learned the system in an afternoon. The Greeks borrowed this alphabet and added vowels. The Romans borrowed it from the Greeks. The entire tradition of Western alphabetic writing descends, in a direct line, from those 22 letters scratched onto Phoenician shipping records in the harbours of Tyre and Sidon 3,000 years ago. The purple dye empire began to fade after Alexander's conquest of Tyre. Not immediately. Tyrian purple remained the prestige textile of the ancient world for another 1,000 years, and Roman emperors would eventually claim exclusive right to wear it. But the monopoly was broken, the network disrupted, and the stranglehold that one city had maintained over one extraordinary substance through a combination of geographic luck, commercial intelligence, and deliberate secrecy was loosened by the sword in a way that all the ancient sieges before Alexander had failed to accomplish. The causeway he built to take Tyre still exists today. It has grown over the centuries as sand and silt accumulated around it and turned the island into a peninsula. Walk out to the old city of Tyre now, and you are walking on Alexander's causeway, the destruction of one of the ancient world's greatest port monopolies, made permanent in stone and sediment. In the year 2000, a French underwater archaeologist named Frank Godiot was conducting a survey of the seafloor in Abu Qir Bay on the northwest coast of Egypt, roughly 30 kilometers east of Alexandria. His equipment was sophisticated: side-scan sonar, sub-bottom profilers, magnetometers, and his team was thorough. They had been working in this bay on and off for years, looking for traces of ancient naval battles, ancient cities, ancient anything. The water in Abu Qir Bay is shallow and murky, grey-green and full of suspended sediment from the Nile Delta. Visibility sometimes no more than a meter or two. It is not, by any stretch, a glamorous diving environment. But what Godiot's team found that year, lying beneath about 8 meters of water and several meters of soft marine sediment, was something that rewrote the history of ancient Egypt's relationship with the sea. They found Thonis-Heracleion, an entire city, one of the most important port cities in the ancient Mediterranean world, lying on the seafloor where it had sunk between the 2nd and 8th centuries CE, preserved with a completeness that no land site could match. Statues 6 meters tall, still standing upright in the mud, as if waiting for someone to come and look at them. Stone sarcophagi, sealed, their contents intact. Hundreds of anchors from dozens of different periods of maritime history, each one a snapshot of a particular moment when a ship tied up in this harbour and conducted its business before sailing on. 64 ships scattered across the bay floor, their timbers still holding shape after 2,000 years of burial. Hundreds of bronze coins, gold jewellery, temple offerings, fragments of inscription, and the inscriptions, the ones that could be read, confirmed what other textual evidence had suggested, but never proved, that this was Thonis, the Egyptian name for the city that the Greeks called Heracleion, the great customs port at the mouth of the Nile, the place through which virtually all foreign trade with Egypt had passed for at least 5 centuries before the city disappeared. The discovery was sensational and deservedly so. But what Thonis-Heracleion reveals about the way ancient Egypt managed its port trade is, in some ways, more interesting than the spectacle of its rediscovery. Because Egypt's approach to maritime commerce was fundamentally different from the Phoenician model, and understanding the difference tells us something important about the range of strategies that ancient states used to control their harbors. The Phoenicians built outward. They established ports across the Mediterranean because they were a small, resource-limited people who needed the wider world's markets to sustain their standard of living. Their commercial empire was extensive and dispersed. Egypt, by contrast, built inward. Egypt in the first millennium BCE was one of the richest, most self-sufficient civilizations in the world. It had grain, papyrus, gold, stone, and a vast agricultural surplus fed by the annual Nile flood. What it needed from foreign traders was selective: certain luxury goods, certain metals, timber from Lebanon, silver from the Aegean. And what it wanted, above all, from those foreign traders was control, not to integrate them, not to learn from them, but to manage them, to allow them access to Egyptian markets on Egyptian terms, at Egyptian prices, in Egyptian places. Thonis-Heracleion was the instrument of that control. It sat at the canopic mouth of the Nile, the westernmost and most navigable of the 7 branches through which the river reached the sea. Every foreign ship entering Egypt, Greek, Phoenician, Levantine, Cypriot, was required to pass through Thonis-Heracleion before proceeding upriver to the markets of Memphis or Sais or any other Egyptian city. At Thonis-Heracleion, the ship would stop. Its cargo would be assessed. The harbour master, in Egyptian, the Naucratis, a title that would eventually lend its name to a famous port city, would record what was on board and calculate the tariff owed to the pharaoh's treasury. The appropriate offerings would be made at the temple of Amun, which stood in the center of the city, and whose priests had a formal role in the customs process, lending divine sanction to the taxation of foreign goods. Only after all of this had been done, the assessment, the tax payment, the temple offering, could the foreign merchant proceed. And even then, the destination was not simply Egypt. For much of the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, Greek merchants in particular were directed to a specific city called Naucratis, a trading post in the Nile Delta that Egypt had designated as the only place where Greeks were permitted to trade. This policy, the confinement of foreign merchants to a designated port, was not unique to Egypt. We will see versions of it in Guangzhou, in Venice, in the Japan of the Tokugawa shogunate. It reflects a consistent logic. You want the trade, you need the trade, the tax revenue, and the imported goods are valuable. But you do not want the traders wandering freely through your country, learning things you would rather they did not know, forming alliances you have not approved, potentially making common cause with your subjects in ways that threaten your authority. The designated port is the solution. Come and trade, but stay where we put you. Naucratis was, in many ways, a Greek city on Egyptian soil. It had Greek temples, Greek magistrates, a Greek agora, where merchants from different Aegean city-states conducted their business. Herodotus, the great Greek historian who visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE, describes it with evident familiarity, the way you might describe a home away from home. Greek merchants who spent time in Naucratis learned Egyptian things, the measurement systems, the religious customs, the agricultural calendar, and brought those things back to Greece, where they filtered into Greek thought and culture in ways that the Greeks themselves sometimes did not fully acknowledge. The influence of Egyptian religious iconography on early Greek art, the influence of Egyptian mathematics and medicine on Greek science, the influence of Egyptian religious practice on Greek mystery cults. All of these passed in part through the harbour of Naucratis, through the controlled, mediated, carefully supervised contact that Egypt permitted between its civilization and the world outside. What the inscriptions at Thonis-Heracleion reveal, with almost bureaucratic precision, is the mechanism of that control. A stele, a stone slab inscribed with a royal decree, was found standing on the harbour floor, its text a proclamation from the pharaoh Nectanebo I, dating to the 380s BCE. The text regulates the taxation of goods passing through the port with a specificity that is remarkable. 10% of all gold, silver, timber, and processed wood arriving from the Sea of the Greeks, a phrase that referred broadly to the Eastern Mediterranean, is to be paid to the temple of Neith at Se, the pharaoh's patron goddess. Any ship that lands in Egypt without stopping at Thonis-Heracleion to declare its cargo and pay this tax will have its goods confiscated. The penalty is total. The enforcement mechanism is the harbour master and the temple priests, working in tandem. This is not a primitive custom system. This is a sophisticated revenue collection apparatus embedded in a religious and bureaucratic framework that makes evasion extremely difficult and religiously problematic. You are not just cheating the tax collector if you try to sneak goods past Thonis-Heracleion. You are cheating the god. And in a world where the god's curse was a real thing that real people feared, this was a meaningful deterrent. The city's eventual submersion beneath the sea is, in retrospect, almost inevitable given its geography. Thonis-Heracleion was built on a low-lying island in the Nile Delta, a landscape that has always been geologically unstable. The sediments beneath it are water-saturated and subject to liquefaction. The land surface a few meters above sea level at most. Over the centuries, the combined effects of subsidence, rising sea levels, and probably one or more major seismic events caused the land to sink gradually, then catastrophically, until what had been a thriving city became first a lagoon and then a seafloor. The people presumably had time to leave. There are no mass casualties in the archaeological record. But the buildings, the temples, the statues, the anchors, the ships, the thousands of ordinary objects of daily commercial and religious life, all of those simply went down with the land and lay there, perfectly preserved by the anaerobic conditions of the seafloor sediment, waiting for Frank Godio's sonar. When you look at the photographs of the discoveries, the granite face of a pharaoh rising from grey-brown water, perfectly intact, its eyes still sharp after 20 centuries of darkness, it is difficult not to feel something that goes beyond historical interest. There is a quality to the light underwater, a kind of amber-grey softness that makes the objects look not so much ancient as simply paused, as if the harbour master stepped away for a moment and will be back shortly to resume his work, as if the ships are simply moored overnight and will be loading again in the morning, as if the business of controlling who enters and what they pay has merely been temporarily suspended, and the harbour is waiting, as harbours always wait, for the next ship to come in. In 483 BCE, a vein of silver was struck in the mines of Lorion, in the southern part of the Attica Peninsula, that was larger than anything the miners had found before. The Athenian citizens who owned shares in the mines, and the city government that received a portion of all mining revenues, were faced with an unexpected windfall that the city's assembly would have to decide how to use. The obvious choice, and the popular one, supported by many powerful politicians, was to distribute the windfall directly to the Athenian citizenry as a cash dividend. 10 drachmas per citizen, some sources suggest, which would have been a meaningful sum for ordinary Athenians. A comfortable windfall, a popular gift, a way for the current political leadership to cement its popularity with the voters. A man named Themistocles had a different idea. Themistocles was, depending on which ancient source you read, either a visionary statesman of the first order or a devious, self-promoting schemer of exceptional cunning. He was probably both. He had been watching the Persian Empire's westward expansion for years, and he understood, with a clarity that most of his contemporaries lacked, that Persia's next invasion of Greece would come by sea. The Persian land army had already been stopped at Marathon. If Persia came again, it would come with a fleet. To stop a fleet, you needed a fleet, and to build a fleet large enough to matter, you needed more money than Athens currently had. Until now. Themistocles persuaded the Athenian assembly to use the silver windfall not for a citizen dividend, but to build 200 triremes, the sleek, fast, lethal warships that were the cutting-edge military technology of the ancient Mediterranean. It was one of the most consequential political decisions in Western history. 3 years later, at the Battle of Salamis, those 200 ships, combined with allied Greek vessels, destroyed the Persian fleet in the narrow straits of the island of Salamis, and effectively ended Persia's ambitions in Europe. Athens had saved Greece, and in saving Greece, Athens had made itself the most powerful city in the Greek world, a position it would use over the next several decades to build an empire. But here is what the Battle of Salamis story tends to obscure. The silver and the ships were only half the equation. The other half was Piraeus. The port city of Piraeus, 5 kilometers south of Athens, was not a natural harbor in the sense of something simply discovered and used. It was, in the early 5th century BCE, a project, a planned port complex conceived and developed with deliberate strategic intent that would become one of the most sophisticated commercial and military harbor facilities in the ancient world. Piraeus had 3 natural harbors: Kantharos, the main commercial harbor; Zea, primarily for military vessels; and Munichia, a smaller anchorage. And what Themistocles and his successors did was turn this natural geographic advantage into a fully engineered system. Stone quays, ship sheds that could house up to 372 triremes under cover, warehouses, dry docks, commercial stoa, colonnaded market buildings, and the Emporium, the dedicated trading zone where foreign merchants could conduct business under Athenian commercial law. What linked Athens to Piraeus was as important as the harbor itself. The long walls, a double line of fortifications connecting the city to the port, transformed Athens and Piraeus into a single defensive unit that could withstand a land siege indefinitely, as long as the sea remained open. An enemy army could surround Athens on land, but as long as Piraeus was accessible and Athenian ships controlled the sea lanes, food and supplies could come in, and the city could hold out. The long walls were built in the 460s BCE, and their logic was clear. Athens was not a city that happened to have a port. Athens was a port system, a harbor with a city attached. The commercial life of Piraeus in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE was extraordinary in its scale and diversity. The Emporium was one of the busiest trading floors in the ancient world, a place where grain from the Black Sea coast, copper from Cyprus, timber from Macedonia, papyrus from Egypt, wine from the Aegean Islands, and silver from the mines of Lorient, all changed hands in a daily churning of commercial activity that funded the Athenian state, fed the Athenian population, and paid for the Athenian navy that kept the whole system working. The grain trade was perhaps the most vital. Athens's agricultural land was simply not large enough to feed its growing population there, and the city was dependent on imported grain from the Black Sea region for a substantial portion of its food supply. Controlling the sea lanes to those grain sources was not merely a commercial priority. It was a survival imperative. This dependency on imported grain-shaped Athenian foreign policy in ways that are sometimes underappreciated. The Athenian Empire, the network of allied and subject cities that paid tribute to Athens during the 5th century BCE, was not primarily a territorial empire in the way we usually imagine empires. It was a maritime protection racket, conceived and maintained to ensure Athenian control over the sea lanes that kept Piraeus supplied. The tribute paid by allied cities went largely to maintain the Athenian fleet. The fleet maintained control of the sea routes. The sea routes kept the grain coming. The grain kept the citizens fed and the democracy functioning. Every part of the system was connected to every other part, and the port was the pivot on which the whole thing turned. There is something remarkable and somewhat ironic about this relationship between the port and Athenian democracy. The philosophical tradition tends to present Athenian democracy as an achievement of civic virtue, of education, of the rational deliberation of free citizens in the assembly. And it was all of those things, but it was also, in a very material sense, purchased with harbour revenue. The silver from Lorient built the fleet. The fleet controlled the sea lanes. The sea lanes brought the grain that fed the poor citizens who had the time to participate in the assembly, because they were not spending all day trying to find food. The commercial prosperity of Piraeus created the surplus that allowed Athenians to fund the festivals, the temples, the philosophers, the theatre, all of the cultural achievements that we associate with the Athenian Golden Age. Pericles did not build the Parthenon with virtue. He built it with port revenue and tribute from the maritime empire. And every column and every carved frieze was paid for by the controlled, taxed, carefully managed flow of goods through the harbour of Piraeus. The people who actually ran Piraeus, who conducted most of its daily commercial business, were not Athenian citizens. They were metics, resident foreigners, people from across the Greek world and beyond who had settled in Athens and Piraeus to conduct trade, but were not permitted to become citizens, could not own land, could not participate directly in Athenian politics, and paid a special tax for the privilege of being resident aliens. The metic population of Athens Piraeus may have numbered in the tens of thousands, and they included some of the wealthiest and most commercially sophisticated individuals in the Greek world. The great 4th century banker, Paschon, who ran a money-changing and lending operation out of Piraeus that amounted to the largest banking business in the ancient Greek world, was a former slave who had been freed by his previous owner and granted metic status, and who eventually, through a combination of commercial success and civic generosity, was granted Athenian citizenship, one of the very few metics to receive this honor. Paschon's business was a direct product of the harbour economy. He ran a trapeza, a table, which is the origin of the Greek word for bank, since early bankers literally conducted business at a table in the market. where merchants could exchange foreign currencies, take deposits, receive letters of credit, and borrow money for commercial ventures. His operation was probably the closest thing the ancient world produced to a modern commercial bank, complete with a branch network, professional accounting, and credit instruments that could be used across the Mediterranean. And it existed, could only have existed, because Piraeus was the kind of place where people from a dozen different cities arrived every day, with foreign coins in their pockets, and the need to conduct business in Athenian silver. The defeat of Athens by Sparta in the Peloponnesian War in 404 BCE came with a symbolic finale that made clear how completely the port defined the city. One of Sparta's first acts after the surrender was to demand the demolition of the long walls. The crowds who came to watch the walls come down were told, according to Plutarch, that the demolition marked the beginning of freedom for Greece. But what it actually marked was the cutting of the connection between the city and its harbour, the severing of the artery that had made Athens powerful. Without the long walls, Piraeus was no longer part of Athens in the most fundamental strategic sense. The city could be starved. The port could be taken. The system that had sustained the democracy was broken. Athens recovered. The long walls were rebuilt. The harbour kept working. The grain kept coming. The metics kept banking. History rarely delivers the clean ending that defeated power's enemies imagine they have achieved. But the moment of their demolition remains one of those episodes in ancient history that illuminates with unusual clarity the relationship between commercial infrastructure and political power, the way in which the harbour was not just a support system for the city, but was in many ways the city itself. If you had approached Carthage from the sea in the 3rd century BCE, in the years when the city was at the height of its power, when it was the richest and one of the most populous cities in the Mediterranean world, the first thing you would have seen rising above the line of the city walls would have been the tip of an island, a circular island, sitting in the middle of a circular harbour, surrounded by the masts of warships so densely packed that from a distance they resembled a forest growing from the water. This was the Kothon, the military harbour of Carthage, and its design was so extraordinary, so deliberately and precisely engineered, that when Roman archaeologists began excavating the site in the 19th century, they initially refused to believe that what they were looking at was ancient. It seemed too planned, too sophisticated, too much like something from a later era of urban design. The Kothon was actually 2 harbours joined together, occupying a large area of the southern shoreline of the Carthaginian peninsula. The outer harbour, roughly rectangular, was the commercial port, the place where merchant ships loaded and unloaded cargo, where warehouses lined the quays, where the daily business of the Mediterranean's busiest trading city took place in the noise and smell and press of 10,000 transactions. The inner harbour, connected to the outer by a channel that could be sealed with chains, was circular, roughly 300 meters in diameter, and at its center sat the circular island, the Admiralty Island, where the commander of the Carthaginian fleet had his headquarters in a tower, tall enough to see over the city walls and out to sea. Around the perimeter of the circular harbour, built into the stone walls, were the ship sheds, covered dry docks, each one sized to hold a single warship, each one with a launching ramp leading directly into the water. Ancient sources give the number of these ship sheds as 220. Modern excavation has confirmed that the design could accommodate at least that many. The separation of the military and commercial harbors was not an aesthetic choice. It was a security decision of the first importance. The military harbor could be completely sealed off from the commercial one and from the commercial harbor's view. Visiting foreign merchants, and Carthage, like all great port cities, depended on foreign traders, could conduct their business in the outer harbor without ever seeing the warships being readied in the inner one. They could not count the fleet, could not assess its state of repair, could not report back to their home cities on how many triremes or quinqueremes Carthage had available. The circular harbor was a state secret hiding in plain sight within the city. You could walk past it and not know what was in it. You could do business in the outer harbor for years and have only vague rumors about what lay on the other side of the connecting channel. This design philosophy, the separation of what the public could see from what the state was doing, extended throughout Carthage's commercial institutions. The Carthaginian government was, by ancient standards, unusually opaque about its finances and its military capabilities. The city was governed by a merchant oligarchy, the suffet, two chief magistrates elected annually from among the leading families, supported by a council of elders and a court called the Court of 104, whose exact function is still debated by scholars, but which appears to have served as something between an audit committee and a supreme judicial body, holding generals and admirals accountable for their campaign's results. This structure was not democracy in the Athenian sense, but it was a commercial republic, a government designed by and for people whose primary interest was the smooth functioning of trade, and whose instinct was always to keep commercial information proprietary. The Carthaginian commercial empire was the direct successor to the Phoenician one. When Tyre was weakened first by Nebuchadnezzar and then destroyed by Alexander, Carthage inherited the Western Mediterranean networks that Tyre had built and extended them further. Sardinia, Sicily, or most of it, the Balearic Islands, the south coast of Spain, the northern coast of Africa, from the Gulf of Sirte westward to the Atlantic. All of these were part of a Carthaginian sphere of commercial influence, maintained by a combination of treaty, colony, and naval power. The city's wealth was staggering by ancient standards. Ancient sources describe Carthage's treasury with a reverence usually reserved for divine things. The city's merchant families funded private trading expeditions that rivaled the commercial enterprises of entire Greek city-states. One of the most intriguing stories to emerge from Carthage's commercial history is that of Hanno the Navigator. Hanno was a Carthaginian admiral who, probably in the 5th century BCE, led an expedition through the Strait of Gibraltar and down the Atlantic coast of Africa, planting colonies along the way and ultimately reaching a point somewhere in West Africa, perhaps as far as modern Guinea or Cameroon, before turning back. We know about this expedition because of a document preserved in a Greek translation called the Periplus of Hanno, which is one of the most fascinating and frustrating texts in ancient literature. It reads partly as a straightforward navigation report. Here is where we stopped. Here is how many people lived there. Here is what we found. And partly as something stranger, with descriptions of burning mountains, probably volcanic eruptions or possibly the seasonal burning of grassland, and hairy wild people on an island who fought when the sailors tried to capture them. These wild people, whom the locals called gorilli, were almost certainly chimpanzees, or perhaps actual gorillas. possibly the first description of great apes in any surviving text. Hanno's voyage and the colonial settlements he established along the African coast were part of a larger Carthaginian strategy of commercial expansion that consistently pushed the boundaries of the known world. Like the Phoenician merchants before them, the Carthaginians understood that the further you could reach, the fewer competitors you had. A trading route that no one else knew about was a trading route that no one else could undercut. The Atlantic coast of Africa, the tin-bearing shores of Cornwall, the silver mines of Spain. All of these were Carthaginian commercial secrets, maintained by the simple expedient of going to places that other Mediterranean peoples had not yet figured out how to reach. Rome's relationship with Carthage was, for centuries, a commercial partnership before it became a military confrontation. The two cities signed formal treaties at least twice, in 509 BCE and again around 348 BCE, that divided the Mediterranean into commercial spheres of influence. Under these treaties, Roman merchants were permitted to trade in certain Carthaginian ports, but were excluded from others, and the agreements included provisions about tariffs and the treatment of shipwrecked vessels that presuppose a long history of commercial interaction between the two powers. What eventually transformed the partnership into the catastrophic series of wars known as the Punic Wars was not commercial rivalry alone, but the intersection of commercial interests with territorial ambitions in Sicily, the island at the center of the Mediterranean that both powers recognized as the key to controlling the entire sea. The First Punic War, beginning in 264 BCE, was fundamentally a struggle for control of Sicilian ports. The Second Punic War, despite Hannibal's extraordinary land campaigns, was won and lost at sea. Rome's ability to maintain its Atlantic grain supply while cutting Carthage's Mediterranean ones eventually strangled the Carthaginian war effort as thoroughly as any military defeat. And when Carthage was finally destroyed by Rome in 146 BCE, leveled to its foundations, its fields salted, its population killed or sold into slavery, Rome's first act was to dismantle the Kothon. Not just take it over, dismantle it, fill it in, remove it from the world as completely as possible. This act of deliberate destruction tells us how thoroughly Rome understood what the harbor represented. Carthage's power was not in its armies, which Rome had defeated. Carthage's power was in its commercial network, in its accumulated knowledge of trade routes and merchant relationships, in the institutional machinery that the harbor represented and concentrated. As long as the Kothon existed, Carthage could potentially rebuild. As long as the circular harbor was intact, with its ship sheds and its Admiralty Island, and its carefully engineered separation of military and commercial functions, the city could become again what it had been. Rome did not merely defeat Carthage, it destroyed the harbor. It understood that the harbor was the city. When Alexander the Great stood on the Egyptian coastline in 331 BCE and chose the site for his new city, he's said to have made his decision based on the geography with a speed that surprised his advisors. He walked the shoreline, examined the natural anchorages, looked at the offshore island of Pharos and the lake of Mariotis behind the narrow coastal strip of land, and announced that this was the place. He sketched out the city's street plan himself, in broad strokes, the two main axes of the grid, the harbour layout, the sites of the major temples. Then, characteristically, he left. He never saw the city he had founded, never walked its streets when they were paved, never saw the lighthouse that would make it the most famous harbor in the ancient world. He died in Babylon 8 years later, and his general Ptolemy, who took Egypt as his share of Alexander's divided empire, completed the project. What Ptolemy and his successors built was, over the course of about a century, the most deliberately engineered port city in the ancient world. Not the largest. Rome's Ostia Portus complex would eventually handle more raw tonnage. Not the oldest. Tyre and Sidon had centuries of history behind them, but Alexandria was the most intentional. Every feature of the city's design served a purpose that connected commerce to knowledge, and knowledge to power, in ways that the ancient world had not seen before and would not see again in quite the same form. Start with the lighthouse. The pharaohs of Alexandria, built on the offshore island of the same name and connected to the city by a causeway called the Heptastadion, was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and the only one of the 7 that served a genuinely practical function alongside its monumental one. It was tall. Ancient sources give estimates ranging from 100 to 150 meters, which, if accurate, would make it one of the tallest structures on Earth for much of its existence. It had a fire burning at its top that could be seen, according to the ancient writers, from distances of 50 kilometers or more. It had a system of mirrors, metal reflectors, that amplified and directed the light. And it had a distinctive 3-stage design, square at the base, octagonal in the middle, and circular at the top, that made it recognizable even before you were close enough to see the fire. The practical function was clear enough. Ships approaching the Egyptian coast needed to know where the harbor entrance was, especially at night, especially in the frequent haze and low cloud that characterizes the eastern Mediterranean in certain seasons. The lighthouse solved this problem with an elegance that was also a display of power. The message to approaching ships was literal and metaphorical simultaneously. We can light your way from 50 kilometers out. We have the wealth, the engineering knowledge, the organizational capacity to build something that reaches for the sky and burns without ceasing. Come to our harbor. We have what you need, and we are not afraid to announce it. But the more extraordinary aspect of Alexandria's port control was invisible. It lay in a policy that the Ptolemaic kings maintained with extraordinary consistency over several generations. A policy that was, at its core, an act of systematic commercial intelligence gathering disguised as administrative procedure. The policy was simple. Every ship that entered the harbor of Alexandria was required to surrender any scrolls or books it carried on board for copying. The originals would be returned, eventually. First, the library's scribes would copy the texts. The copies would go into the collections of the Monsoon, the great research institution that housed what we know as the Library of Alexandria. And the originals, if they were indeed returned, were sometimes returned with the notation that these were in fact the library's copies, and that the ship was receiving the duplicate. We know about this policy from Galen, the 2nd century CE physician, who mentions it in the context of discussing which editions of Hippocratic texts were most authoritative, and who describes the Ptolemaic copying program with what sounds like mild professional admiration. The library wanted everything, not just Greek texts, though those were the core of the collection. Everything. Egyptian religious text, Babylonian astronomical records, Indian mathematical works, Persian court documents, the navigational manuals and merchant records that passing ships might be carrying. The Library of Alexandria was, in this sense, the most ambitious intelligence-gathering operation the ancient world had yet conceived. Every ship that came in gave up its information. Every merchant who arrived in Alexandria potentially carried knowledge that the library's agents were empowered to acquire. Consider what this meant in practice. A ship from the Black Sea coast, carrying grain south to Alexandria, might also be carrying a Scythian diplomat's correspondence with a Parthian court. A ship from India, loaded with pepper and cotton, might have in its hold a navigator's manual describing the monsoon routes in detail that no Alexandrian knew. A merchant vessel from the Phoenician coast might carry a cargo manifest that revealed the existence of a trading settlement no one had mapped. All of this passed through the harbour of Alexandria, and all of it became, through the copying policy, part of the Ptolemaic state's accumulation of knowledge about the wider world. The library itself, the physical building, the scrolls, the scholars, was the product of this commercial intelligence system made visible. Scholars were invited from across the Greek world and beyond to come to Alexandria, where they would be housed, fed, and paid from the royal treasury in exchange for their intellectual work. The monsoon functioned something like a state-funded university. There were lectures, debates, research programs in mathematics and astronomy and medicine and philosophy. The geographer, Eratosthenes, working from the library's collections, calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy in the 3rd century BCE, using data about the angle of the sun's shadow at different latitudes that could only have been assembled through the systematic collection of information from travellers arriving at the harbour. The astronomer Hipparchus compiled his star catalogue using Babylonian observations that had come through Alexandria's copying program. The physicians of the Alexandrian school had access to medical texts from Egypt, Greece, the Levant, and Persia in a way that no other ancient medical centre could match. All of this was, in a deep sense, a product of the harbour. The Library of Alexandria was the intellectual wing of the port of Alexandria. It was the mechanism by which the Ptolemaic state converted the commercial advantage of its geographic position at the junction of the Mediterranean and the Red Sea trade routes, at the mouth of the Nile, at the centre of the ancient world, into a monopoly on knowledge that reinforced and deepened the commercial monopoly. You came to Alexandria to trade. While you were there, you gave up what you knew. The city took your goods at the harbour and your scrolls at the library, and sent you on your way a little lighter in both respects, and considerably more grateful for the privilege of access to Alexandrian markets than you might otherwise have been. The commercial life of Alexandria was organised around the harbour with an efficiency that later generations of port planners would admire and imitate. The city sat between two bodies of water, the Mediterranean to the north, accessed through the Great Harbour and the smaller Western Harbour, and Lake Mareotis to the south, a large, shallow inland lake connected to the Nile by canals. This meant that ships could come in from the sea, from Greece, from Rome, from the Levant, from the Black Sea, and unload their Mediterranean cargo directly into warehouses at the northern quays. And ships could arrive from the south, from the Nile, from the interior of Africa, from the Red Sea ports connected to the Indian Ocean trade, and unload their southern cargo at the lakeside wharves. Goods from both directions could then be transshipped, transferred from Mediterranean vessels to Nile boats, or from Indian Ocean cargo to Roman grain ships. without ever leaving the city. Alexandria was the world's first great transshipment port, the place where the Indian Ocean trade and the Mediterranean trade met and mingled, and where the profits of being in the middle of that junction were captured by the Ptolemaic state. The papyrus monopoly was the most explicit expression of this intermediary power. Egypt had a near-total monopoly on the production of papyrus, the writing material on which virtually all ancient Mediterranean record-keeping and literature depended. Papyrus grew abundantly in the Nile Delta, but nowhere else in the Mediterranean world. It was lightweight, flexible, writable on both sides, and far more practical for long documents than clay tablets or wooden boards. Every government, every merchant, every scholar in the ancient Mediterranean world needed papyrus, and papyrus came only through Alexandria. The Ptolemies understood this perfectly, and they managed the papyrus trade as a state monopoly with the same systematic commercial intelligence that characterized their management of the harbor. Prices were set, quality was graded, distribution was controlled. When the Library of Pergamum in Asia Minor began to rival the Library of Alexandria and started competing for the same rare texts, the Ptolemies reportedly cut off the supply of papyrus to Pergamum. The king of Pergamum responded by developing parchment, animal skin, treated and stretched, as an alternative writing surface. The word parchment itself derives from Pergamum. The Ptolemies' commercial monopoly created its own technological substitute through the simple pressure of scarcity. The harbor of Alexandria survived Alexander's successors, survived the Roman conquest, survived the conversion of the empire to Christianity, and the gradual decline of classical learning. The lighthouse burned for something like 1,500 years before it was damaged by earthquake in the medieval period, and finally collapsed in the 14th century. For all of those 1,500 years, ships rounded the point of Pharos Island and saw the fire in the sky and knew exactly where they were and exactly what lay ahead of them. The richest, most cosmopolitan, most intellectually extraordinary port city the ancient world had yet produced. A place where your goods would be assessed and taxed, your books copied, your sailors fed and housed, your currency exchanged for Ptolemaic silver, and your return journey provisioned and funded, all within the engineered perfection of a harbor that had been designed from the beginning to make sure that you wanted to come back. Rome, at the height of its imperial power in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, was a city of somewhere between 600,000 and 1 million people, packed into an urban area that could not remotely feed itself from its immediate hinterland. The Tiber Valley and the Campagna around the city could support, at the most optimistic estimate, perhaps 200,000 people on their own agricultural production. The remaining 400,000 to 800,000 people in the city needed to be fed from somewhere else, from Sicily, from North Africa, from Egypt, from Spain and Gaul, from the Black Sea coast. Every year, Rome required approximately 400,000 tons of grain just for basic subsistence. More in good years when the population was larger. In bad years, when the harvest elsewhere failed. This grain moved overwhelmingly by sea. The consequences of this dependency were visible in every aspect of Roman political life. The grain dole, the annona, was one of the foundational institutions of the Roman Republic and Empire, beginning in the 2nd century BCE with the Sempronian grain laws, expanding under the late Republic, and reaching its fullest development under the emperors. The state provision of grain at subsidized or no cost to Roman citizens was not charity in the modern sense. It was political maintenance. The grain dole kept the urban poor fed, kept the potential for urban unrest manageable, and kept the emperors popular in the way that mattered most, in the streets of the city itself, where the crowd's opinion could translate very quickly into political crisis. Bread and circuses, the satirist Juvenal wrote, with contemptuous familiarity about what the Roman population demanded. But the bread half of that famous equation was, in practice, an extraordinarily complex logistical achievement that depended entirely on the functioning of the Roman port system. The problem was that Rome's natural harbour, the mouth of the Tiber River at a place called Ostia, was not a good harbour. The Tiber was shallow, silting constantly, prone to floods that deposited silt bars across the river mouth with annoying regularity. Large cargo ships, the grain freighters that were the workhorses of the Roman commercial sea lanes, could not navigate the Tiber at all. They were too large, drawing too much water to get anywhere near Rome without running aground. So they would anchor offshore, in the roadstead outside Ostia, and transfer their cargo into smaller lighters, flat-bottomed riverboats, which would then navigate the Tiber upriver to Rome's warehouse district along the bank, a journey of 25 kilometers through the increasingly congested waterway of the lower Tiber. It worked, but it was slow, expensive, and vulnerable. A storm could make the offshore roadstead untenable, the lighters unable to reach the anchored freighters, and Rome's food supply could be disrupted for days. The Emperor Claudius, in the 40s CE, decided to solve this problem permanently. He ordered the construction of an entirely artificial harbour north of Ostia, cut directly into the coastline at a place now called Fiumicino. The construction was on a scale that astonished even the Romans, who were not people easily astonished by large building projects. 2 enormous curved moles, artificial jetties, built from concrete, poured into wooden forms and then sunk into the sea, extended out into the water, creating a protected basin of about 80 hectares between them. At the entrance to the harbour, on an artificial island created by sinking an enormous grain ship filled with concrete, a lighthouse was built in deliberate imitation of the Pharos of Alexandria. This harbour, which Claudius named Portus, the port, with a simplicity that suggests either supreme confidence or deficient imagination, was connected to Rome by a canal running parallel to the Tiber, so that ships could unload their cargo directly into the canal system rather than fighting the river. The construction story includes one of those details that somehow captures the entire spirit of the Roman engineering mentality. The grain ship that was sunk to form the lighthouse island was not just any vessel. It was the same ship that had been used to transport the obelisk, now standing in St. Peter's Square, in Rome from Egypt to Italy, during the reign of Caligula, a vessel so enormous that it had required ballasting with 2,000 tons of lentils for the journey, and that had been deemed too large and too unwieldy to be kept in active service afterward. Claudius's engineers surveyed this massive ship, decided it was the perfect foundation for a lighthouse island, filled it with pozzolanic concrete, the volcanic ash-based cement that was Rome's great structural innovation, and sank it in position at the harbour entrance. The lentils and the obelisk ship and the lighthouse and the harbour and the grain supply of the entire capital of the Western world were all connected in one extraordinary chain of practical Roman problem-solving. Claudius's Portus was expanded significantly by the Emperor Trajan about 50 years later. Trajan added an inner hexagonal basin, the famous Portus Traiani, visible in aerial photographs today as a strikingly geometric indentation in the Italian coastline, which provided a completely calm anchorage, even when the outer harbour was rough, allowing loading and unloading to continue in weather that would otherwise have disrupted the supply chain. The hexagonal design was not arbitrary. It maximized the perimeter of the inner harbour relative to its area, which meant maximum quay frontage for mooring ships, which meant maximum throughput per unit of water surface. It was, in its way, as sophisticated a piece of port engineering as Carthage's circular military harbour, though applied to an entirely commercial problem rather than a military one. The people who ran this system, the merchants and ship operators who contracted with the Roman state to carry grain from North Africa and Egypt to Portus, were a distinct professional class called naviculari, shipmen. The naviculari were not state employees in the way that, say, legionary soldiers were. They were private contractors, often organized into collegia, professional associations, something between a trade guild and a mutual insurance society, who received state subsidies and legal protections in exchange for maintaining the grain supply. They were exempt from certain municipal liturgies, the compulsory public services that Roman cities imposed on wealthy citizens. Their ships, in a technical legal sense, were registered as serving a public function, which gave them certain privileges in the harbour, and they were responsible, collectively, for meeting the tonnage requirements that the annona demanded each year. If they failed, the consequence was not merely a fine or a legal penalty. The consequence was Rome running short of grain, which was a consequence that the emperor was highly motivated to prevent. The grain supply produced its own geography of power. The North African provinces, modern Tunisia, Libya, and the coastal strip of Algeria and Morocco, were perhaps the most agriculturally productive territories in the Roman Empire. And they knew it. The city of Carthage, rebuilt by Rome after its destruction, and become a large, prosperous Roman metropolis by the 1st century CE, was the administrative centre of this grain-producing region, and its harbour was among the busiest in the western Mediterranean. The port of Leptis Magna, in modern Libya, was wealthy enough in the 2nd century CE that its most famous son, the Emperor Septimius Severus, could afford to rebuild the harbour with a grandeur that makes it still one of the most impressive Roman sites in the world. The ruins of the Leptis Magna harbour complex, with their colonnaded quays and warehouses and the great lighthouse platform, are among the finest surviving evidence of what a Roman commercial harbour actually looked like when properly maintained and generously funded. What makes the Roman harbour story particularly poignant is its vulnerability. All of that engineering, all of that institutional sophistication, all of those contracts and subsidies and professional associations and imperial inspection regimes, it could be undone by a bad North African harvest, by pirates raiding the grain routes, by a political crisis in Egypt that disrupted the Alexandrian shipments, by a storm that sank a dozen grain freighters at once. Roman history is punctuated by grain crises, moments when the system failed and Rome's urban population, a population that could not feed itself, that had no agricultural hinterland to fall back on, that depended entirely on the sea lanes, came face to face with the fragility of the harbour-based food supply on which it had built its existence. The Great Fire of Rome, the crises of the 3rd century, the eventual fragmentation of the Western Empire. All of these catastrophes had a grain supply dimension, a moment when the harbour system faltered, and the city began to understand that the sea's generosity was not guaranteed. The harbour at Portus continued operating as a significant commercial facility well into the medieval period, long after the Western Roman Empire had formally ceased to exist. The hexagonal basin that Trajan built became eventually a lagoon and then a lake, and today you can see its distinctive shape from the air as you descend into Rome's Fiumicino airport, which was built, not coincidentally, on the same stretch of coastline where Claudius's engineers drove their wooden pilings into the seabed 2,000 years ago. Every flight descending into Fiumicino passes over the ghost of Portus, the harbour that fed 1 million people. Most passengers do not know it is there. When most people think of the Silk Road, they imagine camels. They imagine a long, dusty overland route winding through deserts and mountain passes from China westward to the Mediterranean, carrying silks and spices and exotic goods across the roof of the world. This image is not wrong exactly. There was indeed an overland Silk Road, and it was genuinely important. But the image is, at best, half the story, because the majority of the goods that travelled between the Roman world and India and China in the first few centuries CE, the majority by volume, by value, and by the evidence of the archaeological and documentary record, travelled not by camel, but by ship. Not through the mountain passes of Central Asia, but through the ports of the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Sea, and the Indian Ocean. The overland Silk Road was the famous route. The sea route was the profitable one. The key to the sea route was something that generations of sailors had understood empirically for centuries before anyone wrote it down: the monsoon wind system. The Indian Ocean is one of the few places on Earth where the prevailing winds actually reverse direction with the seasons. From roughly April to September, the southwest monsoon drives strong, consistent winds from the Arabian Sea toward the Indian subcontinent. Exactly the direction a ship needs to go if it is sailing from Arabia or the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf toward the Malabar coast or Sri Lanka or the ports of the Bay of Bengal. From roughly October to March, the northeast monsoon reverses the pattern. The winds blow back from India toward Arabia and East Africa, exactly the direction a homeward-bound ship needs. This wind reversal is caused by the differential heating of the Indian subcontinent relative to the ocean, a seasonal thermodynamic pump that operates with the reliability of clockwork. Indian and Arab sailors had been exploiting this system for centuries before the Greeks or Romans knew it existed. They had developed sailing schedules calibrated to the monsoon's timing, ships designed to take advantage of the seasonal winds, port facilities that anticipated the predictable flood of arrivals at the start of the favourable wind season and the predictable departure at its end. The ports of the Malabar coast, Barigaza, modern Baruch, Muziri, Calicut, operated on a seasonal rhythm that was as regular as an agricultural calendar and equally productive. When the southwest monsoon arrived, the ships came. When the northeast monsoon arrived, they left. In between, the business of the world's most productive trade route was conducted with a thoroughness and sophistication that the Roman merchants who eventually participated in it found simultaneously dazzling and slightly humiliating. The Greek merchant and geographer, whose account survives in a text known as the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, written probably in the 1st century CE, possibly by someone with direct personal experience, of the Indian Ocean trade gives us the most detailed surviving ancient description of how this system worked. The text is remarkable for its practicality. It is not a work of geography in the abstract sense, like Strabo's monumental compilation of classical geographical knowledge. It is a merchant's handbook, written for merchants, describing not just where the ports are and how to reach them, but what you can buy in each one, what you should bring to sell, who governs the port, how the harbour master expects to be treated, what the anchorage is like, and whether you need a pilot to navigate the approach. It is the kind of document that Ea-Nasir's correspondents in Ur would have found immediately useful 4,000 years earlier, a practical guide to the harbour economy of the known world. The Periplus describes the port of Baragaza in loving detail, and what it describes is a harbour of considerable complexity. The approach to Baragaza was dangerous. The Gulf of Kumbat, Ati, the head of which Baragaza sits, has a tidal bore that can be violent and unpredictable, with tides rising and falling several meters within hours. The Periplus notes that the local king maintained a fleet of small boats specifically to meet arriving foreign ships and guide them through the treacherous entrance. This was not generosity, or not only generosity, it was a commercial necessity. Without the pilots, foreign ships would wreck on the tidal shoals. With the pilots, they arrived safely, entered the harbour, and began spending money. The king's pilot service was a loss leader for the port economy. The goods that moved through Baragaza were extraordinary in their diversity. Incoming ships from the Roman world brought wine, copper, tin, lead, coral, glass, raw cloth, and most valuably, gold and silver coin. The Periplus notes that Roman coins were accepted directly in Indian markets, without exchange into local currency, a testament to the prestige and reliability of the imperial monetary system, and to the depth of commercial integration between the Roman Empire and the Indian trading world. Going the other direction, Roman ships loaded pepper, ginger, cardamom, cotton cloth, indigo, silk brought overland from China, and the famous Indian muslin called woven air by Roman writers, because it was so fine it seemed to be made of nothing. These goods arrived in Portus and Ostia, were unloaded and inspected and taxed, and distributed across the empire, at prices that reflected the extraordinary distances they had travelled. The Roman Empire's balance of trade with India was, by ancient accounts, deeply unfavourable to Rome. The elder Pliny, writing in the 1st century CE, complained in terms of genuine economic anxiety that Rome was sending 50 million sesterces a year to India in gold and silver coin that did not come back, that was absorbed into the Indian economy and stayed there, draining the Roman monetary system of precious metal. Pliny's numbers cannot be verified and are probably exaggerated, but the underlying complaint is real. Roman demand for Indian luxury goods was enormous and constant, and the Indian merchants who supplied those goods had little corresponding need for Roman products. They wanted bullion. They got it. The monsoon trade was, from the Roman perspective, a persistent current account deficit maintained by the imperial treasury's willingness to keep sending coin eastward rather than do without the pepper. The Red Sea port of Berenike in southern Egypt was the Roman Empire's main gateway to the Indian Ocean trade, and recent excavations there have been spectacularly productive. Archaeologists have found in the trash middens outside the city's warehouses the material remains of a genuinely global trading community, peppercorns by the thousands, imported from India, teakwood timbers from the Indian subcontinent, used in construction, fragments of Chinese silk, coconuts from South Asia, a fragment of a document in Tamil, the language of the Indian merchants who apparently maintained a resident community in Berenike through at least the 2nd century CE. The city was not beautiful. It was a desert port, hot, waterless, dependent on imported food and water, transported by camel from the Nile Valley. But for several centuries, it was one of the most important commercial choke points on Earth, the place where the wealth of the Indian Ocean passed through on its way to Rome. The sailors who navigated the monsoon routes developed an organizational sophistication around their seasonal harbor visits that amounted to a portable commercial culture. They did not simply arrive in a foreign port, sell their goods, buy return cargo, and leave. They built relationships. They established personal connections with local merchants and harbor officials that persisted over years and decades, creating networks of trust and obligation that made future transactions smoother and safer. They learned languages: Arabic, Tamil, Malay, eventually Chinese, not because they were required to, but because speaking the language of your trading partner was a commercial advantage. They left behind not just coins, but cultural influences, and they carried back not just goods, but ideas. The spice merchants of Arabia, the gem traders of Ceylon, the silk merchants who connected the monsoon routes to the overland Chinese trade. All of these people participated in a commercial system of remarkable sophistication that operated largely outside the awareness of the Roman and Chinese states whose subjects consumed its products. The monsoon ports were international spaces, governed by their own commercial customs and their own forms of commercial law, maintained by the shared interests of the merchants who used them, rather than by any single political authority. In this sense, they prefigured the great free trade port cities of the modern world: Singapore, Hong Kong, Dubai, places where the logic of commerce creates its own kind of order, independent of the political arrangements that surround it. The knowledge of the monsoon winds, which had been the Indian Ocean merchants' great commercial secret, was apparently discovered by a Greek sailor named Hippolus sometime in the 1st century BCE or early 1st century CE. The Periplus credits him with the discovery of the direct open ocean route from the Gulf of Aden to the Indian coast, exploiting the southwest monsoon rather than hugging the coastline. Hippolus may have been the first Greek to make the direct crossing. He was certainly not the first person to make it. The Indian and Arab sailors, who had been using the monsoon for centuries, would have found the idea that a Greek had discovered the route mildly amusing. But his voyage marks the moment when the Roman commercial world became aware that the Indian Ocean trade was accessible by direct sea route, rather than through the mediation of Arab and Indian middlemen. And that moment, like all moments when a commercial secret becomes general knowledge, changed the economics of everything. In the middle of the 8th century CE, the city we now call Guangzhou, then known as Guangfu, though foreign merchants of the period often called it Canton, was probably the most cosmopolitan city on Earth. This is a remarkable claim, and it deserves some unpacking. Cosmopolitan cities are not unusual in human history. Athens in the 5th century BCE, Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE, Rome in the 1st century CE. All of these were cities where people from dozens of different cultures mingled, but in all of those cases, the dominant culture was clearly dominant. You were in a Greek city, or an Egyptian city administered by Greek rulers, or a Roman city. The foreigners were guests, residents, tolerated participants in an essentially monocultural framework. Guangzhou in the Tang dynasty was something different. It was a city where, by all surviving accounts, the foreign merchant communities were so large, so long established, and so well organized that they constituted almost a parallel city within the city. The Arab community, merchants and sailors from Arabia, Persia, and the wider Islamic world, which by the 8th century controlled most of the Western Indian Ocean trade routes, lived in their own district called the Fanfang, the foreigners' quarter, which had its own mosque, its own market, its own legal system for disputes among members of the community, and its own political leadership in the form of a headman appointed by the Arab community itself and recognized by the Chinese authorities. The Persian community had similar arrangements. So did the Jewish merchants, who appear in the documentary record with sufficient regularity to suggest a significant long-term presence. So did the Indian traders from the Malabar coast. So did the Malay sailors, who were the backbone of the Southeast Asian trading networks that connected Guangzhou to the Spice Islands. The Chinese government's attitude toward this extraordinary multinational commercial community was a product of the same logic we have seen in every great port city. You wanted the trade, you needed the revenue, but you also needed to manage the foreigners carefully enough that their presence did not destabilize your society or your political order. The Tang approach to this problem was, in its way, elegant. The Fanfang system segregated the foreigners geographically, which limited their integration into Chinese society and made them easier to monitor. But within the Fanfang, the foreigners were allowed extraordinary autonomy, their own laws, their own religious practices, their own commercial customs. The Chinese authorities collected their taxes at the harbor, assessed their goods through the official market superintendent called the shibosi, and left the internal affairs of the foreign community largely to the community itself. The goods that flowed through Guangzhou in the Tang period were, by any measure, spectacular. Are spices from the Spice Islands of modern Indonesia, cloves, nutmeg, mace, which commanded prices in China comparable to what they commanded in Rome, because both civilizations had developed a taste for these flavors without any ability to produce them locally. Aromatics, frankincense, camphor, benzoin, aloes wood, which were essential for religious rituals across Asia, and which grew only in specific, geographically limited regions accessible through the maritime trade routes. Ivory from East Africa, carried in Arab ships across the Indian Ocean, and then through the Strait of Malacca to the South China Sea. Cotton cloth and finished textiles from India. And going the other direction, Chinese silk, which had been the luxury textile of the Western world for a millennium, and Chinese porcelain, which was beginning its long career as the other defining luxury export of Chinese civilization. The harbor system that managed all of this was centered on the Pearl River estuary, the broad, island-dotted inlet at the mouth of which Guangzhou sits. Ships from the South China Sea would enter the estuary, navigate upriver to the city, and moor at the quays along the river embankment. The shibosi, the maritime trade supervisor, the harbor master in all but name, would board the ship, assess its cargo, and collect the import duty, which in the Tang period ran at approximately 10% of the cargo value. The foreign merchants would then be permitted to sell their remaining goods in the Fanfang market or in the designated foreign trade market under the supervision of official brokers. They were not, in principle, permitted to travel freely through the Chinese interior. They were not permitted to buy Chinese goods directly from Chinese producers, but had to work through official intermediaries. The system was designed to capture the commercial value of the foreign trade, while minimizing its social and political disruptive potential. For most of the 7th and 8th centuries CE, this system worked extraordinarily well. Guangzhou grew into one of the largest cities in the world. Arab traders who visited it left accounts of its scale that their readers back home found difficult to believe. A city of hundreds of thousands of people, its waterfront extending for kilometers, its warehouses crammed with goods from every corner of the known world. The Arab geographer Ibn Khordad Bey, writing in the 9th century, described the maritime route from the Persian Gulf to China in detail that suggests it was well traveled by merchants who knew it intimately. The route went from the Persian Gulf to the coast of India, then through the Strait of Malacca, then north through the South China Sea to Guangzhou, with specific stops at specific ports along the way, where water and provisions could be taken on. It was a known route, a mapped route, a commercially developed route, the longest maritime trade route in the ancient world, running roughly 14,000 kilometers, and it terminated at the harbor of Guangzhou. Then, in 879 CE, the route was violently disrupted. The rebellion of Huangshao, which had been tearing through northern China for several years, reached Guangzhou. The city was sacked with a thoroughness that the surviving accounts, filtered through the horror of their Arab and Chinese authors, describe as catastrophic. The Arab writer Abu Zayd al-Sirafas, writing in the 10th century CE based on earlier accounts, gives a figure of 120,000 foreign merchants killed in the sack. Arabs, Persians, Jews, Christians, in addition to the Chinese dead. The figure is almost certainly exaggerated in the manner of medieval chroniclers, confronted with atrocities too large to quantify precisely. But the underlying event was real, and its commercial consequences were devastating and long-lasting. The Arab and Persian merchant communities of Guangzhou, those long-established, carefully organized, semi-autonomous foreign quarters that had been the engines of the Indian Ocean trade's China connection, were effectively destroyed. Surviving merchants fled to other Chinese ports, to ports in Southeast Asia, to the Srivijaya Empire's harbour city of Palembang in Sumatra, which rapidly emerged as an alternative entrepot for goods that could no longer safely be taken directly to China. The maritime Silk Road did not end. It rerouted. The trade continued because the commercial imperative that drove it was too strong to be stopped by even a major catastrophe. But the specific geography of the route changed, and with it, the specific harbours that captured the profits, and with that changed the specific political authorities that could tax and benefit from the world's most productive trade route. This pattern, a great port city disrupted by violence, the trade route rerouting around it, the commercial benefits moving to a new set of harbours, is one of the recurring rhythms of maritime commercial history. It happened to Tyre after Alexander. It happened to Carthage after the Punic Wars. It happened to Guangzhou after Huang Chao. It would happen to Constantinople after the Ottomans, in a different way. The route always finds another harbour. The harbour that loses the route finds itself diminished in ways that are sometimes irreversible. The question of which port captures the trade is never permanently settled. It is always contested, always vulnerable, always dependent on a combination of geography, political stability, commercial infrastructure, and the willingness of merchants to feel safe when they arrive. Guangzhou recovered, eventually. The Tang dynasty's successor states, and then the Song dynasty, rebuilt the port's commercial infrastructure. By the 12th century CE, Guangzhou was again one of the busiest ports in the world, and the Shibosi system was generating revenues that made it one of the most important sources of income for the Song government. The memory of the 879 massacre faded. The foreign merchant communities slowly re-established themselves, and the Pearl River estuary filled again with the masts of ships from across the world. The harbour endures. The harbour always endures. There is a building in Venice called the Arsenale, the Arsenal, and if you visit it today, you will find it partly a museum, partly a venue for the Venice Biennale. Its vast brick halls and water-filled basins hosting contemporary art installations, where once they hosted the most extraordinary manufacturing operation the medieval world had ever seen. The Arsenal was founded in 1104 CE and was progressively expanded over the following 3 centuries, until, at its height in the 14th and 15th centuries, it occupied approximately 15% of the total land area of the city of Venice. It employed, at peak production, up to 16,000 workers, an astonishing concentration of industrial labor for the pre-industrial world. And it was producing, at that peak, 1 complete warship per day. 1 ship per day. The Venetians, when they needed to, could outfit an entire fleet in the time it took their rivals to finish building a handful of ships. When Henry III of France visited the Arsenal in 1574 and watched a galley being assembled from keel to sea ready in the time it took him to eat lunch, about 2 hours by contemporary accounts, he reportedly could not quite believe what he had seen. It was the production line, centuries before the word existed, and 2 centuries before Henry Ford was born. The Arsenal achieved this through what modern industrialists would call standardization and process management. Hulls were built to consistent designs, components were manufactured separately and in parallel, and the final assembly was a rapid sequential process moving down a channel of water, with each workstation handling one specific task before the half-finished hull moved on to the next station. It was the ancient world's answer to mass production, and it worked. But the Arsenal was only the most visible manifestation of Venice's port strategy. To understand what Venice actually did, what made it not merely a capable port city, but the dominant commercial power in the medieval Mediterranean for roughly 4 centuries, you need to understand the geography that Venice was working with, and the extraordinary institutional creativity it brought to the problem of turning that geography into a commercial monopoly. Venice sits in a lagoon, not on the edge of a lagoon, but in the middle of one, a shallow, protected body of water behind a barrier island that separates it from the Adriatic Sea. The lagoon is Venice's defining geographic feature, and its military implications were obvious from the city's founding in the chaotic 6th and 7th centuries CE, when successive waves of invasion were sweeping across the Italian peninsula, and the refugees who eventually built Venice were looking for somewhere that Germanic horsemen and Byzantine armies could not easily reach. The lagoon provided that security. You could not march an army across a lagoon. You needed boats, and Venice controlled the boats. What the lagoon also provided, over time, was a commercial position of extraordinary convenience. Venice sat at the northern end of the Adriatic, which meant it sat at the closest point in the Mediterranean to the Alpine passes that connected Italy to the markets of Central Europe. The Po Valley, the most productive agricultural and industrial region in medieval Italy, drained into the Adriatic within easy reach. The great cities of northern Italy, Verona, Padua, Milan, Cremona, were connected to Venice by river and road in a way that made Venice the natural gateway between the Mediterranean trading world and the European interior. And the Adriatic itself, the long, narrow sea that runs between Italy and the Balkans, was a Venetian lake for most of the Middle Ages, its eastern shore studded with Venetian colonies and trading stations that gave the city's merchant fleet safe harbours all the way to the Aegean. The Venetians, over the course of the 11th and 12th centuries, used the leverage of their naval power and their commercial reputation to extract from the declining Byzantine Empire a series of trading privileges that amounted to a monopoly on eastern Mediterranean commerce. The Golden Bull of 1082, issued by the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, in exchange for Venetian naval assistance against the Normans, gave Venetian merchants the right to trade throughout the Byzantine Empire, free of all customs duties, with their own trading quarters in Constantinople, their own dock, their own warehouses. No other merchants in the empire, including Byzantine subjects themselves, enjoyed these terms. Venetian goods moved duty-free while everyone else paid. This was not merely a trade advantage. It was a structural commercial advantage so large that it effectively subsidized the Venetian merchant fleet at the expense of every competitor. Constantinople, the Byzantine capital and the greatest city in Europe in the medieval period, became a Venetian commercial colony in everything but name. The Venetian quarter on the Golden Horn, the Venetian embolum, was a city within a city, self-governing, legally distinct, commercially autonomous. The Venetian bailo, the city's representative in Constantinople, was simultaneously a diplomat, a commercial regulator, a judge for disputes among Venetian subjects, and a harbour master for the Venetian docking facilities. The bailo's archive, which has partially survived, is one of the richest sources we have for the commercial life of medieval Constantinople. A detailed record of what was traded, at what prices, under what legal arrangements, by people from dozens of different origins, all funneled through the Venetian commercial infrastructure. The Fourth Crusade of 1204 CE, which resulted in the catastrophic sack of Constantinople by crusading armies that had been contracted by Venice to provide naval transport, needs to be understood in this commercial context. The Crusade's diversion from its stated objective in Egypt to the Byzantine capital has been debated by historians for centuries. Was it deliberate Venetian strategy, or a chaotic confluence of debts, political opportunities, and crusader violence that nobody fully intended? The answer is probably somewhere in between. What is clear is that the commercial consequences of the sack favoured Venice enormously. The Latin Empire, established in Constantinople after the sack, was a Venetian client state, and the treaty that distributed the conquered territory gave Venice control of specific strategic locations that read like a harbour master's shopping list: Corfu, Coron, Modon, Crete, key ports and islands throughout the Aegean. These were not random acquisitions. They were the logistical infrastructure of the Eastern Mediterranean trade route, and Venice wanted them not as territory in the conventional sense, but as harbour facilities. The Fondaco dei Tedeschi, the warehouse of the Germans, was one of the most revealing expressions of Venice's commercial control system. All German merchants wishing to trade with Venice were required to stay in the Fondaco, a massive building on the Grand Canal that served simultaneously as a hostel, a warehouse, a customs house, and a surveillance facility. The German merchants could not stay elsewhere. They could not trade independently. They could not deal directly with Venetian buyers or sellers without going through the official brokers whom Venice supplied. Everything passed through the Fondaco and its agents. Every transaction was recorded. Every currency exchange happened at Venetian-controlled rates. The same system applied, with local variations, to Turkish merchants, the Fondaco dei Turchi, to Persian merchants, to Greek merchants. Everyone got a Fondaco. Every Fondaco was a commercial checkpoint. Venice did not merely facilitate trade. It managed, mediated, and taxed every commercial interaction within its reach, and its reach extended, in the 15th century, from the English Channel to the Black Sea. The genius of the Venetian system was that it was genuinely useful as well as extractive. The Venetian state galley system, the regular state-organized convoy voyages that ran to Alexandria, to Beirut, to Flanders, to England on fixed schedules with standardized cargo rates and guaranteed security, provided merchants from across Europe with a reliable, efficient, safe way to ship goods long distances. A Florentine merchant who wanted to send cloth to Alexandria did not need to own a ship or hire a captain or negotiate with pirates or worry about insurance. He contracted with the Venetian galley service, paid the going rate, and his cloth arrived in Alexandria on schedule. The convenience was real. The dependence on Venice that it created was also real, and that dependence was the foundation of Venice's commercial empire, more durably than any military conquest could have been. The crisis came not from military defeat, but from geography. In 1498 CE, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama successfully navigated around the Cape of Good Hope and reached the port of Calicut on the Malabar coast. The same port described in the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea 1500 years earlier. The same port where the monsoon trade in pepper and spice and cotton had been conducted for millennia. Da Gama had found the direct sea route from Europe to India, bypassing the entire eastern Mediterranean, bypassing Egypt and the Red Sea, bypassing the overland routes that Venice controlled and taxed. The Portuguese could now buy pepper directly in Calicut and sail it directly back to Lisbon without passing through a single Venetian checkpoint. When the news reached Venice, the Republic's financial advisors understood immediately what it meant. Within a decade, the price of pepper in Venetian markets had fallen catastrophically, as Portuguese direct trade goods undercut the prices that Venice had maintained through its monopoly. The city began a long, slow commercial contraction from which it never fully recovered. It remained a significant city, a culturally brilliant city, a city of extraordinary architectural beauty that it maintained through the careful management of its remaining assets and its reputation as a destination for wealthy tourists. But the commercial empire, the empire of harbour checkpoints and fondacci and state galley convoys and trading privileges extracted from declining empires, that empire was over. It had lasted about 4 centuries, and it had demonstrated, with unusual clarity, the essential principle of port-based commercial power, that controlling the harbour is sufficient, if done well enough for long enough, to make you the richest city in the world.